We have Michael Adams, the Chief Commissioner, the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission, the Honourable Peter Hall, QC, Chief Commissioner, New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption, the Honourable Bruce Lander, QC, South Australia, Alan McSporran, the Chairperson, Crime and Corruption Commission, Queensland, Kenneth Fleming, the QC, the Commissioner, Independent Commission Against Corruption in the Northern Territory, Mr Greg Mellick, the Chief Commissioner, Integrity Commission, Tasmania, and the Honourable Robert Redlich, QC, Commissioner of IBAC here in Victoria. Please welcome our Commissioners. And I will invite Commissioner Redlich to set the scene for this session.
Good afternoon, and thank you to those of you who have endured to the end. But I'm sure you'll agree with me it's been an outstanding conference, one which has stimulated all of us. And speaking for myself, I have learned so much in the sessions that I attended. This session is deliberately designed to give the Commissioners an opportunity to say something about our joint communique through their reflections on some of their experiences, all of which have contributed to what we have recognised are common experiences of all of the permanent commissions throughout Australia. A couple of things by way of preliminary. A lot of debate about what we mean by corruption, but I think it must be clearly understood in the context in which we've all met that we're not just talking about crime. We're not talking only about misconduct, which is defined in the various statutes which govern our commissions, but we're talking about breaches of standards. We're talking about deliberate non-compliance with processes that are set down within an organisation. We're talking about nepotism. We're talking about conflicts of interest. We're talking about inappropriate conduct within the workplace. Corruption is simply the term we use because it's difficult to find a single term which encapsulates all of those considerations. But it's important that we understand what we mean when we talk about corruption in the context in which the communication was cast. My experience from the last 2 days has reinforced as tangibly as anything could that the content of our joint communique is absolutely correct. I listened to Justice Coate tell us about the institutional response to sexual abuse and her list of the responses that were given by the institutions over the 5-year period of that commission. I listened to the panel discussion today on corrections. I listened to the panel discussion on local government, and every one of those sessions reinforced the findings which have led to our joint communique. Now, picking up on what Deputy Miller said a few moments ago about culture, we are actually talking about behaviours. And if we all recognise that there are common behaviours which we find wherever there is corruption, then we provide the clearest guidelines to that organisation in being able to redress those behaviours. And it's to that I want to very briefly turn before giving all of the commissioners an opportunity to speak. If you could bring up that slide, please. These are the 5 behaviours which we have identified in the joint communique and which you will all find, either singularly or in combination, in every case where there is corruption. And again, I emphasise I use corruption in the broad sense in which I've outlined it. First, we have the conduct of the employee, the person guilty of some form of misconduct. Now, we're not talking here about the spontaneous unforeseeable breach of standards by an employee. We're talking about preconceived, premeditated, long-term misconduct which organisational failing has permitted to occur. But that's obviously the first form of conduct, and what happens? So often, regrettably, the employee does their utmost to conceal their behaviour. Conceal it by not giving a truthful account, concealing it by destroying incriminating evidence, concealing it by placing pressure on colleagues not to disclose the conduct. Second form of behaviour is that of those that surround the person guilty of misconduct. The colleagues, the workmates, the people who feel through obligations of loyalty, mateship, fear of speaking out, who turn a blind eye. That behaviour of the person guilty of misconduct is not disclosed. And we find that all the time. Third behaviour we focus on is that of the manager or supervisor, whose responsibility it is to see that the person who was guilty of misconduct and those around that person properly disclosed what was going on, insisted upon compliance with processes. And too often we find managers and supervisors fail in their responsibilities. Fourth, the investigators, whether they be internal investigation within a police force or corrections, or those persons appointed within an institution to investigate allegations of corruption. Too often we find less than a rigorous analytical assessment of the evidence. Too often we find that the ultimate recommendations made as to what the outcomes should be are seriously deficient. And finally, the failings of leadership. We've talked throughout the last 2 days about the importance of having a leadership which is willing to expose, to publicly identify and to ensure that the right ethical standards are applied within the organisation. And so it is, and if you reflect back on the last 2 days and your experiences, you will find in every example that's been cited one or more of those failings. Perhaps Katie's right, we shouldn't be talking about a change of culture. What we're really talking about are changes in these behaviours. And the challenge to all of us is how can we best bring about those changes in behaviour.
So that forms the basis of the next 50 minutes or so discussion. I've got a number of questions for the commissioners, but we will shortly get to an opportunity for a few questions from the floor. So I would encourage you to think about that, and there'll be some roving mics. But my first question goes to Chairperson McSporran. So Commissioner Redlich just outlined these behaviours that mask corruption. At a range of levels. In your experience in Queensland, why is it, do you think, these behaviours occur? What sort of things are driving them?
I think one of the best ways to illustrate it is to talk about that well-worn phrase, tone at the top, and to just emphasise that whilst we are inclined to think that that's a given, as it should be, it's critically important, obviously, but it's not enough. In the police service, for instance, it's been 30 years since Fitzgerald that you heard about in the previous presentation, where shocking corrupt behaviour was exposed in the police service. Police service in the 30 years since has come ahead in leaps and bounds. The ELT in the police service now is a highly professional, bright, articulate, productive unit. That tone at the top is a given, as we reasonably expect it to be everywhere. But we've had in Queensland a focus on local government the last couple of years where that is not a given. In fact, there are some shocking examples of failure to have an appropriate tone at the top. An example I'll give very quickly, and forgive me for those of you who heard me speak about this yesterday, but it is important to illustrate how bad things can be and what a devastating effect it has on not only the council itself, but the community around the council and its confidence in the democratic process. Ipswich City Council was led by a mayor who was a very dominant figure. He was so popular, I think it was something like 85 to 90% popularity, and he thought, fortunately for us investigating him, that he was untouchable, that he was simply could do what he liked and regularly did. That had two effects. One is everyone below him, including councillors and staff, thought that he was untouchable, that he could do what he liked, and that anyone who railed against it would be dealt with, and some were. So the staff were terrified of him. The other thing that happened was the councillors, who should have been stepping up to control his behaviour, were too frightened to, because of their own self-interest in worrying about losing their elected positions if he was turfed out of office through a finding of corruption against him, which is what ultimately happened. So it had this shocking flow-on effect for two different reasons throughout the whole council. The mayor was charged, the mayor that replaced him was charged, two CEOs were charged, a senior official in the administration was charged, and a number of employees were charged. Some of that is still going through the courts. It led the government of the day to take the extraordinary step, once we published a report into this behaviour, to sack the entire councillors, including those that hadn't been charged. They railed against that by saying, well, we have not been charged or any proven misconduct, why should we be a victim in all of this? The reality was there were three options. One is the councillors who'd been in that administration had no idea about the corrupt behaviour, which was so obvious to all others, so they were clearly incompetent and shouldn't have been there in the first place. Secondly, they knew about it and did nothing about it, which is more serious, and equally they shouldn't be there. And thirdly, of course, and most seriously, they were party to it, involved in it, facilitated it, and were as guilty as those who were charged and equally should have been dismissed. So that whole event, just that one example I'm giving you, led to a huge crisis of confidence in the Ipswich community about their council. It's under administration. The next election is due in March next year, and the administrator, Greg Cimello, is doing a wonderful job trying to change that culture and build resilience within in particular, the staff of that council. So tone at the top is not a given. It's a daily thing that needs to be reinforced and flow down to the person who's the newest employee on their first day to understand the values expected and to live them.
Thank you. It's a pretty significant example. Commissioner Fleming, do you want to expand on that a little with another example? So what you think are the effects and impacts of these behaviours in organisations and even further on the community?
Thank you. Can we take an example of a department or an agency who administers quite substantial amounts of money? And you have the junior staff, you have middle management, and you have the executive levels. If we can talk for a moment about the junior staff who see things going on in middle management, and let's take one junior person who identifies corruption taking place in middle management. There are a number of things that that person might or might not do. One, they could simply ignore it, carry on, or leave. Two, they could acknowledge it, stay there, become very angry, and perhaps suffer to their own detriment. Three, they can identify a chance and join in the corruption. Or four, they could report it. We take the next step to middle management. This is the place where the contracts are being administered. And that's a high-risk area for corruption. And the junior staff have seen that somebody there is on the take. Which means, of course, that middle management is ceasing to manage. They're far more concerned about their own interests. So the organisation suffers dramatically at its very heart. Middle management are looking at the money that they are making with corruption. They know it can't go on forever, so the behaviour is entrenched so that they can make as much money as they possibly can in as short a possible time. So you get the destruction of middle management. But what about senior management? If you looked closely enough, you would see that they had no policies in place. They had no adequate processes to identify what's been going on. What happens to them? Well, they continue managing in that incompetent way, and so the corruption continues to flourish. What happens then as they look outside into the community with whom they are dealing and with whom they are entering into contracts? The same contractors are getting the work. The same contractors are missing out on the work, despite knowing that they are competitive and good at what they do. You then have a complete breakdown of confidence in that department, and you have a breakdown of confidence ultimately in government generally. So it affects not only the department itself, but very much affects the external view of the department. What happens to the young person? They sit there and do nothing. Corruption continues. They decide that they should leave. Corruption continues. They join in. Corruption is exacerbated. They report. Suddenly there are a whole new series of risks for them. Overall, the worst result is that corruption continues to flourish. There is no contrast. If I was to say the best result, I would have to say there is no best result. It shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Yes, indeed. And so in some ways we're talking a bit about what have people walked past and how do people have the courage or the support or the ability to not walk past things. Chief Commissioner Hall, I'll turn to you. In the work you've been undertaking, how have you seen these behaviours play out in practice?
Well, as the communique records, public officials are entrusted with public power for the public benefit and public good and not for any extraneous reasons. In our Commission's work and in my researches of the other Commissioners' agencies, there is often, unfortunately, some common patterns which partly reflect human nature and partly reflect deficiencies in organisational corruption control systems and partly reflect the lack of training, instruction, emphasis on building a culture of integrity. One finds that most people in the public sector, of course, work diligently and conscientiously. But there's always going to be, I think, and certainly in our work we have noticed, that there are a range of dysfunction. You start with cases of the public official who is deliberately dishonest. They're probably in the minority. For the others are more those who have exercised public functions or powers with that blind spot, that ethical blind spot, and they're different from the first category. But because the definition of corrupt conduct under our Act is broad, they're all potentially within our jurisdiction. It's interesting, in our work, I've noticed in a number of investigations, and I have read in other reports from other states, and I have in mind in one in particular, one of the major IBAC investigations, a common pattern, and that is not corruption at lower levels, but at the highest level. There have been a number in the category of the senior executive officer, if you like, who is the dominant personality. The dominant personality who is aggressive, has a perceived self-confidence, therefore brook no opposition, cuts corners, ignores processes in order to get the result. And this, of course, filters down through the organisation. There are a number that I could mention, these agencies headed up by that sort of personality. And those who work in the agencies feel there is no point in speaking up, that there's nothing they can do that will change that person's behaviour. They are cases of an agency or a department that's headed up by somebody who regards it as their personal fiefdom. Often they derive personal benefits. Sometimes it's just a sheer wanton exercise of power to get a result and show that they are the person who can get the job done, and somehow it is through that mode of operation that they have been seen to be effective and got into the position of senior position. But we would want to say, in agencies like that, and all agencies, that we want to build a culture that has been spoken of here this afternoon, that puts an ethical culture first and performance second. And those categories of case I've referred to are cases which we would hope would see fewer of as time goes by, with the development of both corruption control systems and also a building of a culture, so that focusing on the individual, to give them the support to be brave enough to say, I'm not going to sit here any longer and say nothing. And hence we come to the importance of whistleblower legislation, which has been in our state for a long time, but did not seem to gain great traction, in my view, as a practical and effective platform. It has developed considerably from the early days of its enactment. I still think there is a need for there to be proper instruction and reinforcement with those who work in the public sector, so that whistleblowing legislation is more than words on a page, that they are instructed and understand the principles that lie behind the legislation, the processes that they are available and ought to be used in order to bring to attention a corrupt leader or a corrupt colleague, that they should be ensured that there is an appointed person in their ranks or persons who they can trust to bring forward a reasonably based suspicion without reprisals. It's easy to teach and say these words. It's another one to convince people about it, and hence the reinforcement of all of that is essential, I think, in order to try and, as the communiqué has said, encourage people to step forward, to see it as a noble thing to do, and they will not be alone. The other point is that I think in order to deal with these behaviours we're talking about, we need to bear in mind the changed landscape of the public sector. Very different from when ICAC 30 years ago commenced operations, when often it was the cash in the brown paper bag. Now, of course, with technology, and with the contracting out of government services through a chain of contracts, which now provides an opportunity at many points in the supply chain for corrupt conduct, whether by public officials or those who are employees of the contractors or consultants. So I think these are some of the matters that we encounter, and as I say, it is instructive when one reads the reports of other commissions to see the same type of circumstances that are conducive to corruption, giving rise to corruption. I'm optimistic that we are refocusing our techniques, our approach to both investigative and corruption prevention. And we have to, as I say, because the forms of corruption are very different from what they were 30 years ago, and they'll keep evolving, keep changing. So that I think I would urge that the words of the communique be read and reread a couple of times perhaps, because I think it does capture the essential principles which underpin the work of all our agencies.
Thank you. Certainly, I think we see over and over again that dominant, powerful, charismatic individual who will brook no, who breaks the rules and will brook no opposition in so many examples. Chief Commissioner Malik, I think you've been on quite a journey with the Tasmanian public sector. You were telling me before. Would you like to comment on what's happening in that sector to tackle these behaviours?
Well, the first thing you've got to remember is that the Integrity Commission, of course, is part of the public sector. And we realised quite some time ago that we actually had to change our culture. I actually agree with Katie, culture, however you determine it, is very important in all institutions, but particularly public institutions. So firstly, we had to regain the trust of the public sector by changing our culture from one of being isolationist and confrontationalist to being more approachable and working with the public sector. And once that occurred, it was then a question of educating the public sector to improve the behaviours. It actually surprises me, continues surprising me, the way in which various people think, obviously not having been brought up the way most of us have, and they seem to not understand what's right and what's wrong, or why people would think some of the things they do are not appropriate. With the government departments, most of them, there are still a few recalcitrants, most of them are being directed and usually quite willingly participate in education programs. We've improved those as well to a significant extent now that the online components have been upgraded, and we have very significant attendance at our courses to make people aware of measures that can be taken to overcome the sort of behaviours that Commissioner Redlick's been talking about. The government departments are not as difficult as our major problem area in Tasmania, which are councils. Now, we have 550,000 people in Tasmania, and we have 26 councils. Not that many years ago, it was 49 councils. We would like to actually get it back to 12. When you look at 26 councils amongst 550,000 people, you've got a fairly limited gene pool and some people unkindly suggest that all Tasmanians are related, and that also creates problems because of another issue we have in Tasmania, that many people in government organisations dealing with contracts, members of the public, etc., are dealing with people they know. And part of the education program we're really trying to instill in people is, yes, there will be conflicts, but declare them and manage them. Don't run away from them, and more importantly, don't try to hide them, because that's what starts creating the problems. So we have regular attendance now from councils at our education programs, although a significant number of councillors still think they don't need it. And it's amazing, the ones that don't need it are the ones who've had no formal training. They've never done a company director's course. They're not used to managing large sums of money or managing people. And the other area where we also have some interesting issues is the tertiary institutions, because a lot of them, for some unknown reason, seem to think that they're not really part of the public sector and there's something special, and they don't need to be told how to do anything because they have 1 or 2 or 3 degrees or a doctorate, and therefore they know it all or are above it all. We're gradually getting there. It's a long way to go, but at the end of the day, a few of the investigations we've done, which have caused the resignation or dismissal of senior people in either the public sector or the tertiary institution sector, is getting the message across. So people are becoming more and more inclined to come and seek help or listen to us. And I think that this cooperative approach is the best way to try to get rid of the factors we've been talking about.
And do you think that's actually making headway?
We think so. I think at the end of the day, I would like to see us to do ourselves out of a job. I don't think that'll ever happen. But there seems to have been a significant reduction in the sort of behaviour we've been investigating over the last few years.
Thank you. Chief Commissioner Adams, we've focused so far on the general public sector, and you gave us a very powerful example of law enforcement in your address earlier, but do you have another example or another area of focus that you want to talk about in relation to the masking of corruption and misconduct in a law enforcement setting?
One of the issues for the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission is the quality of investigations undertaken by police. It's absolutely impossible that we could deeply interrogate police investigations. There has to be a large amount of trust, and this means that investigators need to understand their own rules, that is the rules of the police, but also relevant legal principles. We are now, I think, started to be sufficiently trusted where, for example, our Commissioner for Integrity attended a seminar dealing with investigations and investigators, explaining what things need to be attended to from our point of view. Investigators have very much been left to their own devices. Let me give you an example of the level of ignorance. There was a WhatsApp group at a particular station. After it had been going for some time, one of the participants got badly insulted and offended by things that happened. He dropped out, and he then informed senior officers of this group. The WhatsApp exchanges were appalling. They were racist, they were sexist, they were insulting about senior officers. One of the things that came out from the investigation, the police investigated, they gathered the material. We are simply looking at the material gathered by the Professional Standards Command on this. And we look at the dialogue, and we see one where one of the officers talks about a particular case in which she says, more or less, I'm simplifying the language somewhat, in which she says that they fitted up, she and 2 other officers fitted up a particular person who was charged, and that the charges in substance were invented. When we saw this, because the name had been mentioned, we made immediate inquiries and found out that the trial of that person, which resulted in a conviction, had only just been completed. So we sought the information and we asked, why was this information that was available to senior police, because they had seen the transcript, not made available to the defence? And we were told, and the answer was, when we asked that question, well, it really didn't matter. I might say this was not the PSC's responsibility, but the local investigator. He said, well, it didn't matter because it's obvious it was an overwhelming prosecution case because the police witnesses were believed. And I pointed out that, well, yes, they were believed in the absence of this evidence. And then it got, a discussion occurred and it got to the superintendent who was in charge of prosecutions, who said that he had carefully read the evidence and it was clear that the case was overwhelming and therefore there was no miscarriage of justice. There was an appeal, the DPP then got it, and of course the charges were withdrawn. But an absolutely fundamental rule about the provision of evidence to the defence, which assists the defence, completely fundamental to the due administration of justice, was not even recognised by the person who was in charge, he's gone now, then in charge of prosecution. So when you're faced with that kind of ignorance, and I can give you examples, but it doesn't matter, that one, that is sufficient to make the point. It means that unless you're testing what they are doing, cases just go through to the keeper. And this level, and it was corruption because they hid the evidence, just continues. So that is one area which we are exploring more, how to focus on the level of competence of investigators.
Thank you. And to complete the round to Commissioner Lander, so your agency in South Australia has recently released the results of the 2018 Public Integrity Survey, which I understand was to get a better understanding of the perceptions of public servants in South Australia of corruption and inappropriate conduct. So do you have an example you want to give us of how to cultivate a speak-up culture to get these matters able to then be addressed?
We carried out that survey for a number of reasons, but in particular to obtain information in relation to one of the behaviours which is addressed in the joint communique, and that was whether or not we had the confidence of the public sector such that the public sector would report to our office conduct which they had witnessed and which we should be aware of. In South Australia, there are mandatory reporting obligations on all public officers. All public officers in South Australia must report to the Office of Public Integrity, which is an office I head, any conduct that they reasonably suspect raises a potential issue of corruption or serious or systemic misconduct or maladministration in public administration. Now that's imposed upon all public officers in South Australia. The reason why there are mandatory reporting obligations are obvious. Agencies such as ours cannot know of our conduct unless it's reported to the agency, and the best witnesses of corruption in public administration are those actually involved in the public sector themselves. The report of the result of the survey was both worrying and encouraging. It was clear from the answers given by the public officers, and the sample was nearly 13,000 people, which was a significant sample for the size of public administration in South Australia. The responses clearly showed that those in the public sector had no confidence in reporting corruption, misconduct or maladministration internally. 53% of the responses said that they would be worried about losing their job if they reported corruption internally. 43% said they would be intimidated if they were to make a report internally. 22% said that that would cause problems in their relationships with their colleagues. And only 25% of those who responded thought that internally there were adequate protections for people who reported conduct of this kind. So that was worrying. Clearly, most people in South Australia are not confident about reporting this type of conduct internally for the reasons I've mentioned. 40% said that they would, only 40% thought that if they did report internally, anything would be done about it. And of the responses, 25% said that they had previously reported conduct internally and they were satisfied with what was done. 75%, on the other hand, were dissatisfied with the results of an internal report. So that was concerning. As I've said, in South Australia, reporting obligations are mandatory, and what was encouraging was that 80% of those who responded knew that they had a statutory obligation to report this type of conduct to the Office of Public Integrity, which was encouraging. And of that 80%, 69% said they would report the conduct to the Office of Public Integrity. And that showed to us that we had made a difference, at least, in the public sector, such that the public sector had significantly more confidence in reporting conduct to my office than they did internally, and that we were therefore a vehicle likely to receive complaints, to receive reports from members of the public sector. So to that extent, it was encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to throw it open to the audience for, we've got time for a couple of questions. It's a bit hard to see you, and there are microphones. Oh, there you go. Yes.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for the wonderful job you do in terms of anti-corruption. I think we're well served by our state anti-corruption bodies. But I'd like to know from you which one thing you would do or have the government do for you to help improve your effectiveness.
Okay, well, we might just take it from the left. Commissioner Redley. Commissioner Fleming.
I would love the government to start responding properly, and by that I don't mean the politicians, I mean the public servants. I would love them to feel responsible to properly report. We, like South Australia, we in the Northern Territory have mandatory reporting, but for the public sector. However, 24% only of our reports come from within the public sector. 76% of our reports come from people who don't have an obligation to report. And that's troubling my organisation. We would like them to realise their responsibilities to report improper conduct.
We're all independent of government, but we're only as independent as government resources us. I think it's necessary to have in place a system whereby agencies such as ours are resourced independently of the will of the executive. If the executive doesn't want us to investigate it only has to under resources, so it can't. So our independence is entirely dependent upon adequate resourcing.
We had a 5-year review conducted which made 50-odd recommendations, which we agreed. Seems most of them we put up ourselves. The government is committed to enacting them. Unfortunately, only about 5 have been enacted because the rest have fallen down the priority list. It really would make it a lot easier for us if the rest were enacted.
I think I could do no better than agree with what Bruce has said already in terms of a better funding model. It cuts both ways. If you have an independent method of funding commissions like ours, it makes us accountable publicly for the funds we are given and the reasons why we are given those funds, but it also makes the government of the day accountable, the parliament accountable for the allocation of those funds, as opposed to the system we have currently, which is not inadequate for us personally, because we've been treated very well in terms of funding in recent years, but it's not transparent. And it has its awkward moments. For instance, recently we had to assess a complaint against the Deputy Premier, who happens to be the Treasurer, and that can be awkward. Or if we recommend charging of an individual, and our Minister currently is the Attorney General, who has the right, as you know, the ability to stop a prosecution going anywhere. So that's a potential conflict. And our funding comes via, we're a subset of the Department of Justice and Attorney General. So not that there has been any impropriety, but there is a potential awkwardness about those relationships which shouldn't exist, because our funding is so critically important to our ability to protect you, the community. So an independent allocation of resources which is transparently open to both sides, the Commission and the government allocating the resources, being accountable for that process.
I fully endorse what Commissioner Lander has said. This is an issue in New South Wales at the moment. We have proposed to the Parliamentary Joint Committee, and we have emphasised the absolute need for an independent funding mechanism. So thank you for your question. I think it follows from what Commissioner Lander has said and Commissioner Expiron has said, that we were created as agencies by Parliament as independent. The most important word in our title is that word independent commission. And there are two problems with the funding system that has continued too long to date. One is the conflict of interest issue that always lies there and could create real issues. And the second is that you can run interference with the independence of an agency like this directly, or you can run it indirectly, and the indirect way of doing it is to simply turn off the funding tap from time to time. And that will certainly limit and could go close to seriously damaging the independent function of what we can and want to investigate. We are not accountable to executive government. We are not accountable to executive government. An executive government should not have control of the levers in respect of funding. We do have a parliamentary appropriation, which is independent, of course, because it's given by Parliament. Although in the budget process there is input from the bureaucracy. But given the unpredictability of our work, which has always been there, we've had to have what we call grant funding from time to time, but we can only get it if we go to the executive and ask for it. And it's in their gift as to whether they will or they won't. So at the moment there is an issue that is very much one which I have publicly identified. The inspector to our commission, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, Mr. Bruce McClintock, Senior Counsel, who is here somewhere, in his annual report expressed his view that the funding should be free of political and bureaucratic processes. So that's an important issue. If we don't have appropriate funding, we can't investigate potentially matters of corruption in the public interest, and that is a very sad state of affairs should that come to pass.
When my organisation was set up, certain undertakings were made by government. Those undertakings were not fulfilled in relation to finance, And the consequence is that we do very much fewer investigations than we would otherwise undertake. So for us also, resources are of vital importance, and all we want, at present at least, is the money which was promised to the organisation or promised to the Parliament at the time that my organisation was created, and which has not been fulfilled.
Do we have another question? We've probably got time for one.
Thanks very much. We've now got almost all the states and territories up and running with a federal, an integrity body, and the federal government with one to come. Should we start thinking about harmonisation at all? How long would that take, and is it worthwhile?
How do you spell it?
I could say something about that. I think, frankly, I think it's unnecessary for this simple reason. We have a fairly close and productive relationship, all of us, from our respective states and territories. We are very keen to understand differences in jurisdiction and methods of operation and trends in states and territories. We feed off that information exchange regularly. I don't think the setup of our models, individual models, are so radically different that there needs to be a harmonisation of the entire jurisdictions. I think they work very well independently and collaboratively. So, I think you would get into strife, frankly, trying to tinker with that to make it all one model. I don't think it's necessary, personally.
I think we've shown at least that we sing the same tune, if perhaps not in harmony. And I did notice that there are perhaps 7 tenors or baritones here, no sopranos or altos.
It's an interesting issue, harmonisation. I think what's important is that there's a community of learning, if you like, a community of practice around how we continue to build and understand our actions across the public sector to prevent corruption, to detect it early, to have it reported more. And one of the issues that's come out in the sessions yesterday in particular, and again, particularly in the South Australian example, is the public sector continues to underreport these issues. And it's a deep, deep cultural issue. It's an interesting presentation yesterday about how to help whistleblowers or people who have issues to report feel more supported along the way. So I think that's a key takeaway. So I think we're running out of time, and I'm going to invite Commissioner Redlich to make some final closing comments.
So again, I thank you all for joining us for these 2 days. I want to take this opportunity to thank my fellow commissioners who, with enthusiasm, have supported the joint communique. It's really important you take away with you the knowledge. We are speaking with one voice because it is our common experience wherever we are. The air doesn't change because we cross the Murray or because we cross from New South Wales to the ACT, because we're dealing with fundamentals of the human condition. So what I'd like to leave you with is, in summation, how we might break the chain in relation to those behaviours. Over the 2 days, you will have heard in many of the sessions various speakers make some of these suggestions, but they're all suggestions that are directed to those 5 behaviours and how the institutions can address those behaviours. First, with the employee. My glasses out. The employee should be open and honest in all interactions, held accountable, and education, ethics, policy and practice are essential to that being a realistic expectation. The colleagues surrounding the employee who might otherwise be tempted to engage in misconduct has to know what behaviours to look out for, has to know who and how to report, and has to be encouraged and rewarded for speaking up. The supervisor or manager has to know their responsibilities, has to ensure that the staff are accountable and that they are supported. The supervisor or manager has to be a model of ethical behaviour. For all those things to happen, there have to be the right processes in place. There has to be a rigorous risk assessment process that enables every institution to identify where, in relation to those behaviours, there is likely to be a breach in standards. The internal investigation processes require that the investigators resourced and that the investigation is rigorous. There has to be proactive monitoring, and the allegations have to be reported in a timely way. And in relation to senior leadership, there has to be open dialogue about integrity. The more it's talked about, the more likely it is that everyone in the organisation will understand how important maintenance with standards is. Leadership has to raise awareness about reporting and protections that are available. And leadership has to apply an ethical lens to all its decision making. Now, each of these breaks in the chain is encapsulated in two of the final submissions of our joint communique. I encourage you all to read that, to take it with you, and wherever you sit on the public sector spectrum, wherever you sit, you will have an opportunity now to contribute to the breaking of these behaviours. Again, thank you for your attendance. I've heard from so many that the conference has been a success, and it's in no small measure because of your energy and enthusiasm throughout the sessions. So I thank you for your attendance.
So in closing, I think if you look at those at that final slide, notwithstanding the critical role that all these commissioners up here with me play, they are not the guardians of our integrity system in the public sector. Those guardians are you and your colleagues and the people that you work with across the public sector. And if there is nothing else you take from this conference, please take that. Can you join me in thanking the commissioners?